This is a man who doesn't like war. You can tell a lot of the people that he's surrounded himself, whether you want to call them the more libertarian, the more America first, these are people that do not want to see America being the world's policeman. So I don't understand the need for fear other than if it simply is about Ukraine, in which case, I think Europe needs to really take a strong look at itself and start spending more on its own protection.
Hi, I'm Jo Crawford, and welcome to Times Radio's Trump Report. Trump is only days away from his inauguration, and he's expected to make major changes both domestically and internationally, even in his first 100 days. So to discuss this, I'm joined by Jennifer Ewing, the spokesperson for Republicans Overseas UK. Thank you, Jennifer, for joining me on the Trump Report today.
Thanks for having me.
As the exit poll from the election showed in November, the economy, immigration, and foreign policy were the issues that mattered most for Republican voters. It's a big question, but domestically, what do you expect to see from Trump in his first 100 days in office?
Well, I think you just touched on the three issues that a lot of the people who voted for him want to see him get to work on straight away. And I think we know that he's already been working behind the scenes, definitely on foreign policy issues, which we can touch on, later in more detail if you want, but also on the border. He's appointed Tom Homan as the border czar. This is a man who's served under 6 different presidents. He's done the job of the actual, everything from the border guard to, more senior positions. So he really understands that. He's going to be, working on the, whether you call them mass deportations or indeed trying to find the over 300,000 migrant children that have gone missing inside the United States, which is not really talked about. So that'll be the border. And then, of course, there's economy and inflation. I think one of the things you'll see with regards to the economy is getting our energy sector up and running again. The phrase drill, baby, drill. People do not want to sacrifice their heaters or their air conditions or indeed driving their cars, their gasoline cars. So we'll definitely be getting some of the energy back on track.
As you mentioned, economy, it's a big issue for a lot of people in America. The Center for Economic Policy Research, they said that if there was no policy change scenario, growth would be above 2% in 25 and 2026, and inflation moved to 2%, if not below, by the end of 2025. And so that gives Trump a bit of room for experimentation with how he moves forward with tackling the economy and tackling inflation. Is there anything that stands out to you about what he suggested so far on that?
Sure. And, you're right. The economy for many is in really good shape. If you're wealthy, if you hold assets, stocks, you're pretty happy right now. However, if you are, as we discussed, trying to fill up your car with gas and buy some groceries, if you're the average American, you're not doing so well. So one of the biggest mistakes the Biden administration made was in their so-called Inflation Reduction Act, which indeed just increased inflation. It was very, well post COVID and all of that, and they continued to spend more money, and we have, a big inflation problem as discussed. The other thing is the $37 trillion in debt. That, to be honest, and this is where I would be critical of even Trump. And certainly the Democrats, both sides, nobody wants to talk about this outside of some libertarian senators like Thomas Massey. So, the U.S., this debt crisis is going to rear its ugly head. I think it's going to get more and more coverage, and the average American is going to have to become more familiar, educated on, just how out of control our government spending has been by both parties. Trump spent a lot of money in his first term.
And also another big part of the cause behind inflation, which has been felt all over the world, has been due to the war in Ukraine, which I want to touch on later. But a thing that has dominated headlines recent weeks has been Trump's talk on tariffs. This proposal of universal tariffs, which could potentially include up to 60% on US imports from China, for example, but also we've had threats to Canada and Mexico and other Latin American countries on imposing tariffs there. And the Treasury Secretary appointment by Trump, he's also a long-term proponent of tariffs himself. Do you expect Trump to go forward with these tariffs, especially for Mexico and Canada, for example?
So I think it depends, really. And I think what we can look back at, there's what Trump says he's going to do, and then there's what he actually does. In the past, let's take Mexico, for example, as you bring it up, threatening tariffs on, I believe it was on Mexican cars back in 2019, was very, very effective tool that Trump used to get the president at the time, Obrador, to put more control on the border so the fentanyl criminal gangs and the cartels were not getting through our southern border. So, Trump had a conversation with them, said, if you don't start doing something about this open border, we're going to tax your cars. And surprise, it was very effective. I think you can see Canada came as a surprise to a lot of people because it's, of course, our southern border, Mexico, that gets talked about with regards to open borders and illegal immigrants. But there's quite a porous border up north in Canada as well. And, there's that joking conversation that Trump had with, well, I guess still, Prime Minister Trudeau, who's soon to be leaving, where they could become the 51st state. So I think there will be some serious conversations with regards to tariffs, but he's mostly going to be using these as a bargaining tool. He's a deal maker, and so he's going to be using these as a negotiation tool. With regards to China, the Biden-Harris administration left on most of Trump's tariffs, so we'll see what happens there.
And it was interesting because last time that tariffs were imposed on China, it inadvertently pushed China and Mexico closer together on trade, foreign investment. And obviously, there's concerns about China's soft power. Also, with Trump enacting tariffs on steel and aluminium last time, that move sparked retaliation from China and the European Union, and that did impact American farmers. Do you think that potentially Trump is going to make similar mistakes again if he continues with imposing those tariffs on Canada, Mexico, China?
Well, again, let's see, right? Like, let's see how much of a negotiating tool this is or this isn't. I think the fact that Trudeau has resigned. I know he's wildly unpopular now, and Pierre Poilievre is coming in. I just mispronounced that, is coming in. I don't know. I think that's a reaction to what Trump's talking about with regards to tariffs. So I don't believe we will get to the point that these things are actually tariffed. Now, there has been additional talk where Trump has said, oh, maybe we'll get to the point that we go back, however many decades ago, where we didn't have income tax and we just used tariffs as a way to raise money. So, look, it's Trump. He's going to say some wild things. Some of the things he may do, but we don't know. But my suspicion is most of these are going to be used for a negotiating tool, and he's going to be prioritizing American jobs, American manufacturing. Which, of course, when I was just home in California for a few weeks and having conversations, and we're like, gosh, if these tariffs come, all of our cheap Chinese products from Amazon that everybody's gotten so used to having at their doorstep within one day, those will be gone. So there will be some pain felt by the American consumer, who've gotten used to some really cheap goods at the cost of fair wages for workers.
I mean, we saw yesterday that Trump claimed that the Israel-Gaza ceasefire, the deal was only possible because he won the election in November. That's what he's saying. But what I thought was interesting is that he added to that, it signals to the entire world that my administration would seek peace and negotiate deals to ensure the safety of all Americans and our allies. So firstly, I want to know, what does this ceasefire deal symbolize for how Trump is going to move forward with foreign policy in his second term in office?
Sure. So, and as I'm sure you know, because you're at Times Radio, there's still a few moving parts with regards to this. I think overnight Bibi had said, whoa, 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 this isn't a done deal. But let's say that it eventually, this does get done. I believe that what this signals, which is what partially what Trump got elected on, is this is a man who does not like war. He is the only president that in recent history that did not start a new war. He's the only president in our last four that Vladimir Putin did not invade another country under. Of course, Putin invaded Georgia under Bush, Ukraine under Obama, and then again under Biden. So this is a man who doesn't like war. You can tell a lot of the people that he's surrounded himself, whether you want to call them the more libertarian, the more America first, whether it's Bobby Kennedy Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, even J.D. Vance, who served his country and as well did Tulsi. These are people that do not want to see America being the world's policeman and involved in wars all over the place. So I believe if what we're reading is correct, sure, let's give the Biden administration some credit for putting out the framework. However, no one can deny that Trump's comments and Witkoff's comments, that's one of his special envoys to the Middle East, a few weeks ago saying, if we do not have these hostages back by the date of my inauguration, there will be hell to pay in the Middle East. So the timing is interesting. Even Joe Biden last night in his farewell speech gave the Trump administration, the incoming administration, credit for assisting on this. And no, I don't think it would have happened at all because they've had a chance to have some sort of an agreement since October 7th. And it hasn't happened. So yeah, Trump absolutely deserves credit for this. I think he also, if what we're hearing is correct, he did a lot of pushback to Netanyahu. He got him to agree to some things that he didn't want to agree with. So, that's probably why you saw some celebrations in Gaza overnight. So again, I let's see what happens.
And picking up on that global policeman comment that you made, I think it's generally viewed in America that they want less spending on foreign aid, for example, more spent domestically, especially with tackling inflation, things like that. Do you expect Trump to continue to move away from that global policeman role that the US has held in the international community? But then at the same time, he's had this involvement with the ceasefire deal, as he's mentioning, maybe he does want to maintain that role a little bit more.
Well, I guess when I say global policeman, I mean inserting ourselves in, whether it's regime change wars, that sort of thing. I don't believe that served the United States well. I don't see any great success stories coming out of Afghanistan or Iraq or many of the other places that the United States has gone in and tried to be the policeman. Being a peacemaker, that's something entirely different. So, that's what I meant by that.
For many people in Europe, the big question is how will Trump respond to the war in Ukraine? He claimed in the past that he could end this war within a day. But when I spoke to Jamie Shea, he's a former NATO official, yesterday, he said that Trump was facing this dawn of realization on the war and was in some ways backtracking on his claim that he could end the war as quickly as he was suggesting. What do you think of that? Do you think that Trump is having this dawn of realization, as he says?
I think a couple things. I think the number one thing that the American people voted for was to stop paying for wars that are not existential threats to them. And that is, in most Americans' view, the Ukraine-Russia situation. Ukraine has every right to defend itself, right? It's a sovereign country. It was invaded by another country. But America is the biggest supporter of NATO. And I think the Americans who are constantly being told that we need to pay to protect Europe would like to see Europeans who feel that, this war is on our doorstep. I'm sitting in London, so, I'm here too, but would like to see the Europeans up the percentage of their contributions to NATO. A lot of Americans look over at Europe and say, hey, we don't have 4 to 6 weeks of vacation or national health care or a lot of the things that Europeans have. And yet we're paying for the protection of this. So with regards to end it overnight, let's keep in mind that there's not been a lot of diplomacy going on between Biden, Harris, and, say, Putin, right? Whereas one wonderful thing about Trump is that he will talk to anyone, whether that's hostile media, whether that is, dictators from different countries, whether it's allies. And I think that most people would like to see more diplomacy. More talking doesn't mean you have to always agree with people, But no, I think Trump will make sure that this war does not continue. And by the way, not one person has been able to say, what does winning look like? What does Ukraine winning this war look like? I think most people really realize it's not going to get Crimea back, and at this point, it's probably not the eastern. Um, Oblast reasons, probably not going to get that back either. Most people also are now aware that there was a peace deal on the table in April 2022 that the Turks had organized and arranged and facilitated. And Boris Johnson, probably at the direction of some people in the US, scuppered that peace deal. So again, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian and Russian soldiers and citizens have died. So, what are we still doing there? So, I think if I look at I believe Keir Starmer is in Kiev today. I think so. To me, it seems like this is going to be a divergence between the way the UK and the US are looking at this war, with the US looking at the UK and Europe kind of saying, "Okay, this is your guys." We've got other things to take care of, whether it be in the Indo-Pacific region or whether it just be concentrating on our own border. The other thing that I think doesn't get talked about a lot is when Putin's U.S. dollar reserve currency was confiscated, and people are jumping up and down saying, "Oh, let's give that to Ukraine." I mean, that's something that's never been done in the past, and that is not great for the U.S. dollar. If the U.S. dollar, if Trump and the United States wants the U.S. dollar to remain the reserve currency, you've got to, you talked earlier about China and Mexico getting closer together. Well, the actions that have been taken, with regards to these reserve currency has pushed Russia, the BRIC nations closer together. They're starting to use currencies, whether it's their own local currencies or gold or, just a variety of different ways to pay for oil and gas. And the United States, other than our military, our dollar is probably our biggest weapon, and that they're going to want to preserve that.
I mean, coming back to your point about the US not feeling as though that Russia poses this existential threat to the US. On the other hand, if we look at this diplomatically, in terms of keeping American troops safe and protecting American interests around the world, there needs to be that sort of diplomacy there, maintaining relationships with those 31 other NATO allies. And so even though the US may not find it to be as big a threat as, say, Europe does, there is some sort of necessity there to maintain those relationships with the other NATO allies. But what would you say to that?
I agree completely. Yeah, of course we have to maintain our relationships with our NATO allies. And I think that's why Trump's really done them a favor, saying, hey guys, you need to up your spending if you want to, continue on with this war. So I think, we've already seen, I think, of quite a few nations up the way they spend, but certainly not enough. And again, the United States, I mentioned the $37 trillion in debt we have. We've got a border crisis. We've got a lot of things going on. We cannot continue to pay for this war. And by the way, it's not even just the money, which a lot of people will point out, oh, it's a tiny percent of GDP. Sure, true. But it's the munitions. As the Vice President elect J.D. Vance points out, the way in which we produce these munitions, and the weapons, we just don't have enough. So, yeah, we just can't endlessly be supporting this. Also, Ukraine is not in NATO. I don't believe it will end up being in NATO. I think probably any deal that's negotiated is, that's a red line for Russia. It has been for decades. So I don't believe that Ukraine will end up in NATO. It'll probably end up somewhat neutralized, but there's probably experts who know more than I do. But that's my feeling from just some of the ways in which people are talking about how things would wind down.
I'd like to refer you to this poll. It was of 28,000 people from across 24 countries. And they found that in Europe, was widespread about the return of Trump to office. But then outside of Europe, many thought that Trump was not just good for America, but that he'd bring peace and reduce tensions in Ukraine, the Middle East, US China relations. But what was interesting was that one country, South Korea, shared Europe's concerns and anxieties about Trump's return. And South Korea, like most European countries, they depend on their security from the US. So I'd like to ask you, why do you think that is? And what does that say about American allies?
It's funny. I know when you say, the fear and everything. I mean, in the lead up to the election, the last year, anytime I was on a panel or, had other Europeans, on a TV show or whatever with me, like the fear was palpable, right? Like there was a lot of fear. And I personally did not think it was necessary, especially if you take into consideration Trump was already president for 4 years. And, until the COVID situation, we basically had almost 4 years of peace and prosperity. I think most people, if they were honest, um, would much prefer those 4 years than the sort of world on fire we have right now under the Biden Harris administration. So I don't understand the need for fear other than if it simply is about Ukraine, in which case, I think Europe needs to really take a strong look at itself and start spending more on its own protection.
And it's interesting you bring that point up. I know that Trump suggested that NATO allies increase their defense spending to around 5%. In Germany's case, for example, that could potentially bankrupt them if they were to do so. The NATO Secretary General, he suggested around 3.7%, I think it was. If NATO allies aren't going to be able to reach that sort of level of defense spending, how do you think Trump's going to respond to that?
Sure. So if your question is, will Trump try to get out of NATO? There was a bill passed, I believe it was a year ago, December, that basically says like no president, and they were probably foreseeing Trump getting back into office. No president can unilaterally get out of NATO, right? You need Congress and all sorts of other approvals. So I don't think he's just going to ditch NATO. I don't think anybody wants that. I think it's important. It's very important for us, and Europe is certainly our allies. But and whether that's 5%, I doubt very much. Half these people who are at 1.5% are getting to 5%. With regards to Germany going bankrupt, well, I think it's little more than their NATO contributions. It's probably more to do with the fact they went completely green and stopped producing energy and relied too much on Russian oil and gas. So I think there's probably bigger issues in the German economy than their NATO contributions.
And then turning back to America, but also kind of in the UK as well. If we're looking at the Trump's administration, a big figure there is Elon Musk, and he has been very vocal about domestic issues within the UK in recent weeks. How do you see the Trump-Musk relationship going moving forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, up until now, I think that most people who care about the First Amendment in the United States see Elon Musk as a great hero, right? He, thanks to buying Twitter, we got to see the Twitter files and we got to see the amount of censorship that went on. Two biggest censored issues we now know in modern American history were COVID-19 and indeed the US 2020 election with the Hunter Biden laptop and a bunch of, other things that even Mark Zuckerberg recently, up until recently, no big fan of Trump, said, yes, I was pressured by the Biden Harris administration to suppress certain things. So censorship was taking place. Elon Musk has encouraged, as he says, you are all the journalists now. There's an all-time low trust in what you call the legacy media, the corporate media, mainstream media, whatever you want to call it. So people are seeking out other ways in which to get their news, especially anybody under the age of 30. I don't think they go home and, turn on the 6 o'clock news. They're watching it on their phone. So in my view, because I'm a free speech absolutist, I think what Elon has done up into this point is fantastic. Now, with regards to the UK, it is interesting because, like I said, I just spent a few weeks at home in California, and usually you don't have Americans commenting on what's going on in the UK. You just don't. Usually it's UK commenting more on America. But this time I was asked by a wide variety of different people, what the heck is going on in the UK, and can people really get arrested or looked into or even jailed in certain cases for posting online or going to rallies, or all the things that have gone on. So that sort of thing is shocking to most people in the United States, because we don't have hate speech laws. It's the First Amendment. So yeah, and obviously his other thing that he's been looking into are these rape gangs up north. I think that has shocked the United States just on a humanitarian level. Again, it's you could, whatever, without even thinking about this, I'm guessing what Elon is doing is appealing to that average American who Trump discovered in 2016, who feels that maybe because they are not wealthy or they are not living in a coastal city, they don't have a voice, perhaps they're not as educated, that their grievances and concerns are not being taken seriously. And I think that's what, if you look up north or in a variety of these cities, what's gone on with these poor children, it's very relatable.
Just to counter that point, I assume when you're referring to people being locked up for posting online, in relation to the Southport attacks and the riots that spouted from that. A lot of people that were arrested for writing things online, it was inciting violence, it was constituted as being hate speech, for example, which is illegal in the UK. But then on the other hand, Elon Musk, with the grooming gangs, in the first 24 hours in which he started posting about it, he either shared or like directly published misinformation about these grooming gangs, which in turn potentially did fuel a lot of discussion in the UK that wasn't based on the actual facts of what happened there. And so I go back to your point about how, we are the journalists now. But there's that concern there that actually there is a lot of misinformation online, and maybe Elon Musk should be doing more to tackle that rather than actually contributing to it.
Sure, and that is a great point. And you know what? Free speech, it's messy, and it's not always going to get it right. Just like whether it's the national broadcasters in the UK didn't get everything right on a lot of things over the last 4 years, whether
But
it
there
was
should be, I
COVID
guess,
or
there should
whatever.
be that. I mean, if you've got a platform with millions of followers, for example, you should be a lot more cautious about what you are sharing.
Sure, sure. And, they have the community notes. And I believe this will be a work in progress, right? I saw people jump all over Elon and say, hey, that's not true. But what is true is that people are paying attention to this for the first time in years. I've lived here for 2 decades. Occasionally you would hear about this story, but not really. And if it takes an American, South African entrepreneur in the US to highlight this and bring this to the attention so these horrific things never happen again, then you know what? A little bit of misinformation. I guess that's what happens in a free society where people speak freely.
I spoke to Nigel Farage. He's the leader of the Reform Party here in the UK. Elon Musk famously came out and said that Nigel Farage didn't have what it takes to lead the Reform Party. The media sort of went a bit wild covering all of that big story. But when I spoke to Nigel Farage last week, he told me that he expects that Musk won't be saying as much stuff about the UK to upset the British people as he is now when he starts in the Trump administration. Do you think he will? Do you think he's going to hold back?
I think he'll probably have so much on his plate, with the new Doge, the Department of Government Efficiency. That is a big time job. I know they are going to, I just happen to know they're taking a, Javier Milei chainsaw to a lot of people in the government. So he's going to be very busy with that. And of course, he, has his own private companies to run. So yeah, maybe he was just sort of getting the conversation started in the UK. It's funny. I was at an event with Nigel Farage and with Nick Candy, the property developer, a couple days after they had been at Mar-a-Lago in the U.S. And they were very, very encouraged and excited about the relationship that they're going to have with the Trump administration. And I think they'll probably be the conduit. Probably, more than if the Mandelson ambassadorship goes through. I think you'll probably see Nigel Farage or Nick Candy or some other people being used more.
My final question is, how are you planning to celebrate on Monday? Do you have any plans?
Yeah, great question. So Republicans Overseas UK does have a watch party. So that will be going on in central London, but I am going to be doing just some media around it. My colleagues, Greg Swenson, who's chairman of Republicans Overseas, and Sarah Elliott, Lady Sarah Elliott, shall I say, who's also a spokesperson for Republicans Overseas UK. They're both in DC, along with Errol Morcott, who's our fourth sort of media person for our group. So yeah, it's left to me to do some of the UK media. So that's what I'll be doing.
Jennifer Ewing, thank you so much for joining me on Times Radio's Trump Report.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care.